click them all together. And he put the whole thing in a G-clamp and stuck it to the table overnight so that this little proper cover was on it, and that made it into a proper book.
So your dad was your publisher, your first publisher.
Yeah, and he did a good job because the binding still holds together 30 years later, which is better than some published books, actually.
That's really great. You started writing when you were young, and eventually you've come now to the Bartimaeus Trilogy and your new book, which we will talk a little more detail about in a few minutes.
Sure.
Heroes of the Valley, which is wonderful. What I am really interested in both of those books, how you create a fantasy world. Both of them, I would say, are a fantasy world. Even though one might be set in a different kind of London, there are still magicians and genies. And I think that what's interesting to me as a writer, and probably what's interesting to many of our younger writers out there, how do you create a world? I mean, do you sit down and create the world first and then sort of plop your characters in there? Do you start with your characters in the story and then make up bits of the world as you go, or something totally different than that? How do you create these great worlds that you use?
Well, I suppose it's my answer's going to be a bit of a fudge, really, because I can say it's kind of all of those things put together. It's an organic process for me. I would tend to start usually with a character, or possibly a character that's attached to some kernel of idea. So the Bartimaeus Trilogy began with just sort of two related thoughts. One was that I would try and do a story where the human magicians were not the heroes but were the bad guys. That was a kind of conscious effort to do something that was different from what was currently, and indeed still is, very popular. But just try and find a different way into that kind of story. And that was a general premise on which a whole world then developed slowly. But along with that idea was the idea that I would if the human magicians are the bad guys, then who is the hero going to be? And my thought was, well, okay, I'll turn everything around, and we'll have a demon or some kind of supernatural creature who normally in these kind of things is the bad guy. We'll turn it around. He'll be the hero, and he'll be the narrator. And so I started just writing the first chapter, and his voice came out, and Bartimaeus's cheeky footnotes and everything immediately appeared. And at that point, I had no idea what the world, the wider world, wasn't clear to me at all. But I liked the character. And the character then gave me enough momentum to drive into the story and start to just make up stuff which gradually became more solid and concrete and became a very, very three-dimensional thing. So I guess the character is kind of essential. Otherwise, you're not going to get that far into the story. You'll be too bored.
Yeah, it seems to me like you could spend a lot of time just creating a world, but if no one's in the world to do things, so that sounds like
that's nice right. Yeah, because when I was a kid, I spent a long time, quite large amounts of my time writing fantasy-related stories and fragments, and most of them remained fragments because I would do sort of like immensely Tolkienish history showing what had happened to all the kings and queens and stuff of my kingdom, and after a while it was very arid. It ran out of steam because there was no story, and a story has to be about a character. The character is the essential bit. So that's probably having gone around the houses, that probably is the answer. The character's the bit that comes first.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about the new book, Heroes of the Valley. I had the chance to read the book over the holidays before anyone else, and it's fantastic. It's really, really wonderful. We're going to actually hear some of it later on. I thought you're going to read some of it for us, but why don't we start talking about that book? Can you give us just a little bit, what is it about? Tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, the premise for Heroes of the Valley is that it's set in a very different surroundings to the Bartimaeus books. It's set in a valley, strangely enough, with mountains on either side, and it concerns a boy called Hallie Svensson, who grows up in a village high in the mountains. And when he looks up on either side of him, he sees the cairns, the burial cairns of his ancestors, little piles of stones on the ridges on either side. And he hears great stories about how his ancestors were great heroes and how they did amazing deeds. And he wishes that he could be similar to them. Unfortunately, however, he's through quirk of genetics, he's kind of short and a bit stumpy and bandy-legged and basically not really heroic material, which irritates him immensely and gets him into trouble because his frustrations kind of bubble up and he causes trouble with people. And the story really is about how Hallie does eventually get a chance.